heard the bus pull away, and I heard one of my neighbors yell, "Don't touch her." And I saw Tracy, run up to my front door. So I ran to the front door to intercept her, and I looked down, and Lauren was in the street, and the bus was almost out of the neighborhood. And my brain thought, she's too flat and she's too still. So I ran down to her in my socks, and this is March in Michigan. So you can imagine it's cold.
Oh, yeah.
There's melted snow, there's mud. And I got down to her, and I looked at her, and there's bright red blood. I'm a doctor of veterinary medicine, so my science brain was kicking in. And I thought, it's too much, and it's too red. And I had to start CPR. So I went to support her neck so that I could sit her up and take her backpack off of her. And when I went to touch her, her entire head had been crushed. But I knew I had to still start, so I sat her up. And when I sat her up, her head flopped forward like a doll. And that's all I could do. That hit me. So I put her back down. And my dear neighbor came up to me, and I looked at her. I said, "Alice, she's dead." And Alice said, "No, she's not. She's not." And she pushed me out of the way. And she and my other neighbor got CPR started. And then Jack was there right beside me. He'd run down from the door. And he said, "Mommy, what's wrong with Lauren?" And I said, "Honey, your sister's dead." And he said, no. And I pulled him in my lap. And I said, "We're going to get through this because we're a family. And that's what families do for each other."
Yeah.
And then I sent him up to the house to find her blanket and my shoes. And of course, he was beside himself. He couldn't find anything. So another neighbor went up and helped him. I called Doug from the scene, and I had to tell him, "I think she's dead." And then I called my dad, and that was pretty hard. My dad's a rather stoic man, and that took him to his knees. So I insisted on riding with the ambulance to the hospital. And once we got to the hospital, I wanted to be present during resuscitation because I just needed someone to tell me, "Here are her injuries. What do you need us to do?" And I would have said, stop now. The physician on call that day said, or on staff that day said, "No, she's not permitted to be present." And I can tell you that I was calmer than I am right now. So I was shooed off into a room with a social worker, and I don't know, maybe 20 minutes later, the physician came to the door, and he was standing from here to like 10 feet away, 20 feet away from me. And he said, "You know she's dead." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "This was from a standstill," meaning the bus. And I said, "Yes." And he said, "This was from a standstill?" Her pelvis was broken. And he walked away. Then I asked to be with her. I wanted to see her. Oh, we were going to donate. We're going to donate organs, anything that could be donated. And I needed to be present with her body to sign the papers. So they took me into where they had rolled her. And the hospital was under construction at the time, so it was kind of a mess. They took me in where they had put her, and she was still intubated. She still had her chest tubes in, and she looked like a dog that hadn't recovered from a spay. And I was so mad. And I went up to her, and I pulled that endotracheal tube, and I turned to the social worker, and I said, "I want 1-aught Betacryl on a needle. I want needle holders. I want forceps, and I want scissors, because I was going to sew her up." And the social worker said, "You can't." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because they need her body like this for the autopsy. They're already going to be mad that you pulled the tube." And I said, "Okay, if they have a problem with this, you tell them to come to me." I was so mad. So Doug had to fly from Texas that night. He didn't get there till midnight, and he wanted to see her. So we walked. They took us down to where she had been in the morgue, and we had to walk those hallways of hell. And when we finally got to where the morgue door was, they had put her in the doorway, and we had to walk, 50 yards to get to her.
Wow.
Lying dead in the doorway. It was, if there could have been more things that went wrong to complicate our loss, I can't tell you what they would be. So one of the things we did secure after several months and lawsuits and trials, we went back into the University of Michigan hospitals and we talked to the head of ER. And I told him, you've got to have an ABC protocol for families in distress. When they come in with a child who needs to be resuscitated, you have to have a protocol for family presence. And they listened to us. And now, at least at the University of Michigan Children's Hospital, if you come in and your child needs to be resuscitated, and I hope that never happens, you will be permitted family presence if you desire. And so that you have some control over at least that situation.
What an incredible story. And to hear what you had to go through, it's really hard to fathom. From the minute you watched this happen to the minute you, Doug, had to fly in and go see her and the way that they had her. Can I just ask, were they able to donate any of her organs?
Yeah, so there's another little snafu. So we were told that she could only donate her corneas because of the damage done to her body. And about 10 years later, I was told actually they had taken her heart valves as well. And that was a can I was not willing to open to find out where her heart valves ended up. That was another challenging experience with the donation because we weren't permitted to know who received her organs. We were just told that they were donated and 2 people in Chicago got her corneas. So that was another experience that was a bit jarring. And later, oh my goodness, later with the donation, Donate Life, I had the experience of speaking to the woman who I think she was head of donor relations. I can't remember what her job was. And I was made aware that they have a donor Olympics, which I think is wonderful. And people who've received organs can compete. And the people who were the loved ones of the donors can be there in the audience.
Oh, my goodness.
And I said, why was I never told about this? And she said, well, you only donated your corneas. I thought, okay,
hello.
Somebody needs to teach this lady how to talk.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my goodness, you gotta be kidding me. There are a lot of things that happened that can be made better, I think. One of the things too, I would love to put in is that the bus driver was not a pleasant person. She was surly, she was impolite, she was unkind, she was very young. And I realized this several years ago, Doug and I were talking about this, that had she been kind, had she come out of central casting for bus drivers, we would have had a completely different experience. Even at the site, she came back and she was at the site and this poor kid was screaming. She was screaming. And I reached out and I held her arm and I said, this is why they're called accidents and not purposes. Because at the moment, I just felt so horrible for her. Mm-hmm. Now, fast forward a couple of days, that came out. And then I was so mad. I was so angry. Oh my goodness.
So one of the things we learned after the fact was that this bus driver, the school district, like most school districts, had a hard time finding enough bus drivers.
Sure.
So rather than dealing with a potential problematic bus driver, when they got enough complaints about this driver, they would just move her to a different route. And we were the 3rd route she was put on.
Oh boy.
During her tenure there. And so, as angry as we were when we found out about her behavior, I was equally as angry at the administration, particularly the head of the bus driving garage that hires these drivers and has to supervise them, because there's real responsibility there as being a management employee in a position where you have safety sensitive employees.
And you should share what your job was.
And for 30 years, I worked in the trucking industry, and during that time, I was executive vice president of operations for Conway, and ultimately became the CEO there. We took safety very seriously.
Sure.
So I couldn't imagine running our organization the way, they ran their bus district, and the cargo's our children.
Mm-hmm. 100%. And Doug and Julie, have you, was there any contact with the bus driver following this incident? I know it's been many years, but obviously we're talking about forgiveness on this podcast, and
Yeah.
I don't know where you are with all that. But has there been, what type of communication, I guess, was there either then or now?
I have a feeling she tried to send a teddy bear to our son Jackson, who was 10 years old at the time, Lauren's brother. But it wasn't signed. It was the only note. It was the only gift we got that wasn't signed. So I think she tried to reach out in that manner. She was never. She wasn't fired after the incident. She was kept on for 5 months afterwards. And I remember passing her in town while I was going to the grocery store. She passed me. And when she passed me in her car, she looked just as surly and angry as she used to look when she was driving for the kids. So I remember being so triggered by that, and I had to pull over. But that was the last time I saw her, except for during the lawsuit. There was a criminal trial, and she wasn't present for the civil trial, right? She was just a criminal trial where she was charged with involuntary manslaughter, I think, and they plea bargained for that, so that her accountability was the judge's decision.
She did primarily community service.
She had community service. She lost her license for 3 years. She had to maintain a 20-hour-a-week job. She had to work at the jail 1 day a week for 30 weeks, I think, or maybe it was 1 day a month. I can't remember now. And she had to pay restitution, which we canceled because she was sending us checks for $18 a month. And I said, no, stop this now. Tell her to keep her money.
I want to go back to this horrific accident takes place right in front of you. And I know that it's not time that you can step back and really think through the event. And you said, I reached and grabbed her arm. And
Yes.
because you knew how bad she must have felt. And that's instinctual. That's like, you didn't sit there and go, should I not? Does that surprise you that you did that? Is that
No.
who you
I mean,
are?
she was a child that needed to be comforted. I mean, she was 23. She shouldn't have been driving a school bus. She might have been 22. I don't remember how old she was. She might have been 21. I can't remember. But she shouldn't have been driving a school bus. She was not mature enough to drive a school bus. But yeah, that was just an instinct. I had to comfort somebody. She was the one who was in the most distress at the time.
Yeah, you had also talked about some things that have changed since then with the district. Can you tell a little bit more about that? Is there some good that has come out of this as far as maybe some legislation or something that you have helped get changed?
No legislation. The supervisor of this transportation district for the school resigned as a result of this. And so we were never really able to get really any direct information from the school. However, a person that was working there as a part-time driver and helped step up and help lead some change there and became a friend of ours.
Good friend.
And she was just terrific and being very helpful to us. So no legislation. It was just the fact that, at least from my perspective, it was a failure of management to properly supervise people in a safety-sensitive function. And when these incidents occur, her employment should have been terminated along the way. And
Way before she killed Lauren.
way before it ever got
Way
to this
before.
point.
Yeah.
The complaints against her were thick and heavy, and we found that they weren't even being appropriately recorded by the bus, the transportation supervisor. But he did, the other thing was the new supervisor did listen to you about your safety ideas.
Yeah,
he did adopt your safety
they brought in
ideas.
a new individual, and he was very open to suggestions, and he would meet with me on a couple of different occasions. We talked about various aspects of transportation safety, managing people, et cetera. And he adopted several suggestions I brought best practices from industry.
Well, and the hospital also made some changes for
Yes.
an emergency service like this that you had talked about. And I'm
Yes.
sure that at least gave you some sort of comfort knowing that this has changed. Should somebody have to go through something like this, horrific as you have done, something has changed.
I hesitate to say to give me comfort. It
And that was probably the wrong
validating.
word. You're right, Julie.
Right. But even so, there was a criminal case and then there was a civil case. We pressed civil charges. During mediation, the lawyers came up with a number. We said, fine. We wanted safety protocols changed at the school. And the district said no and took us to trial. And so you can imagine what a 12 jury member trial looked like when they heard what happened, and they couldn't even hear what she did. They only heard what happened day of the incident. So after that, and the award was substantial. I said, and I was talking to Bob about this when he and I first talked. We had to go through that. I was so angry. I could have fired off a rocket ship with my anger. That was so unnecessary. She should never have died. This should never have happened. And after the lawsuit was over and the trial was over, I was like, okay, it's not enough. I want my kid back. So I think when people go through something horrific, there has to be accountability. You're going to need to pursue accountability because that's part of the healing process. I would comfort people to know that once you get there, no matter what happens next, you're always going to feel like a piece is missing because a piece is missing from your heart.
But I think, and I wanted to comment on this. It's so incredible that you're here telling your story and how you're going to help so many people. One of the pieces that caught my attention is this was 20 years ago, correct?
24.
24. Yes, it was 24 years ago. But it's still so present, so real, and with loss and grief, I love to continually educate our audience and myself that, I think people have an idea that, well, it's been that long, you're fine now, but you'll never be fine. In the sense that piece will always be missing. Maybe there is purpose. I have found that in my own experience and what I'm doing now, but I still feel that loss.
Right. By the way, Kelly, I'm so sorry for your loss.
Well, thank you.
That was just a horrific experience. You two, everybody went through horrible. One of the things we did was in 2008, we began a nonprofit called Grieve Well. Oh. And what we do is help people with healthy grieving. Our core program is to identify people with lived experience who have experienced loss. And we train that person to be a peer support for a person fresh and lost. So we match you up with somebody. My whole goal is to find you 3 years down the road. And we've been doing that since 2008. We've expanded that product now. We have grief 101 webinars. We have yoga, grief alleviating yoga. We have poetry writing workshops. We do great grief support things in Ann Arbor. And we recently connected with Arizona State University so that we're going to come into the Watts School of Public Policy with the social work school to do research on the viability of peer-to-peer support. And what I know, which is it's more effective than therapy because grief is not a mental illness. Grief is a typical reaction to a harsh life experience, and it needs to be handled kindly and thoughtfully and mindfully, and not labeled as something that, something's wrong with you because you're grieving.
Sure.
Well, no, not at all. Not at all.
Sure. Yeah, wow. One of the things we talk about, Julie, in our forgiveness workbook is turning your pain into purpose. And, this pain, and I'm glad you said that, Kelly, because I just felt like this happened a few weeks ago, not over 20 years ago. Yes. And you have certainly turned your pain into purpose to help so many others. And by being on our podcast, and this is why we love doing the show, is you're helping others by sharing your grief and your story and how you can make a difference.
Thank you. You know, one of the things I like to say, the metaphor I use for grief is that grief is like a kidnapper that comes in the middle of the night, throws you in the car, and then takes off down the street. And it's going a million miles an hour down the street, and it hits the stop sign, it hits the brakes, and you smack up against the back, and then it takes off again, and you roll into the back, and you're like a watermelon in one of those little plastic grocery bags.
Mm.
When you can access a peer to help with the support, then they're in the driver's seat, and you can strap in the front and be in a seatbelt and feel a little bit safer. And I always say, I don't know when it will happen for you, but eventually grief pulls over to the side, gets out of the car, and comes around to you and hands you the keys and says, you can't get out of the car, but do you want to drive now?
Oh,
No, I love that. Yeah. So, Doug and Julie, what would you like our audience to know about your daughter, Lauren, your precious
Oh my
daughter?
gosh.
What do you want to share about who she was at 6 years old?
You want to take this
Go
one?
ahead. Go ahead.
She was just a bright spot. I'll tell you, she was literally an angel on the planet. Although she was sassy. I actually have a really great picture. May I show you my
Oh,
picture?
yeah,
absolutely.
please.
Sure.
So this is Lauren with our dog. Oh, I can't. Can you see it? I'm trying to get the glare off it. It's our
There
dog
you go.
Lucy in one of her fabulous outfits. She had her lederhosen on and her yellow rain boots, and she was loving on her dog as she did. So she was sassy. We used to say this was the kid. I said to Doug, I said, this is the kid who's going to cut her own hair and color on the wall. Buy gum. Same day almost. And then I said, she'll be when she's a teenager, she's going to meet the boy in the letter sweater at the door and get on the guy's Harley at the bottom of the driveway. I wish she could have done that. I really wish she could have done that. So she was full of life and love. She loved everybody. There's never a dog she met that she didn't love. She would go in to pet a dog and would try to bite her, and she'd go, ouch, and then she'd go back right back into pet it. Severely independent.
I remember we were living in California,
Yeah.
and she wanted to learn how to rollerblade, and she was probably what, 4 years, 5
4
years
or 5,
old,
yeah.
and she had on a pink tutu and rollerblades, just a wild Barbie helmet,
Wow.
and she would go 10 feet, land on her butt, and get up, and I would try to support her, and she said, "Daddy, I'll do it myself.
Don't touch me."
Don't touch me." And so just this fierce independent streak, but was going to get every ounce of life she could get out of it. And so she was just a real spark.
Kid never slept.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing so much about your daughter and also your story, because like we said, it will resonate with someone.
Yes.
A lot of people, I'm sure, that can try to understand. You said this metaphor about grief that really hit home and spells it out so perfectly. And when you said, now I want you to take the keys. You can't get out of the car, but I want you to drive. That means you're in control.
Right.
And it seems like you've been driving the car for a little bit now.
Well, and like I say, everybody's different. I don't know when it happens. I don't think you can force it. I love your workbook. I think
great.
it's part of the process of getting to forgiveness. And I got to tell you, forgiveness even is, it eludes me still to this day. I mean, I'll be going great. I totally connect with my higher self, with my God. And I know that Heather played a role in our story. I think, well, everybody has choices, right? After a horrific accident or a horrific experience, you have a choice on how you're going to respond. First, you react because that's the way we're wired. And then later you get to respond.
Mm-hmm.
And when I can connect to my higher source, I know that Heather was merely an actor in our play. And we are doing, I think, what we were given the opportunity to do. But I don't think that comes right away. It's a long process. Any horrific experience allows you to grow emotionally, spiritually, physically, and relationship wise, and you have choices. And some people don't recover. Some people do not get through. They close the door, they lock the windows, and they don't come out of their room.
That's a good point, Julie.
Yeah.
That's real. And that does happen. But it all comes down to how we choose to respond.
Bingo.
And then how we choose to channel that response. And I really, I'm very appreciative of how you two have moved through this, because it's certainly not easy. Julie, I want to go back to what you said with the forgiveness piece. How are you with that with Heather, the bus driver? Where are you with that component? For our audience, I mean, I think it's interesting to talk about this for a minute.
Yes, of course. I'd like you to tell where you got to.
Yeah, so Julie asked me a while back where I was with forgiveness. And I said, I think along the way, I'm not sure when exactly, but I came to the realization that, we had this young person who, from my perspective, was failed by adults. She was put in a position that she really probably shouldn't have been cast in. And then she was completely not supervised and didn't know how to perhaps control her emotions at that age. And so the system failed her to a large extent. And while it would be easy to blame her, it's far bigger than that. And so I just came to terms with the fact that the system failed her, and unfortunately, it should have never been allowed to happen.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to blame her solely for what occurred. Certainly, she had a role, but there were enablers along the way that put her in that position.
They did call her out on it.
Right.
So, and I'd say for me, my forgiveness journey has been back and forth. I mean, I'm fine. And then I'll drive up to Michigan and I'll drive past our street and triggered like that. I'm right back at the spot. I'm right back at the scene. So I'd say this to your listeners: while you're working toward forgiveness, understand and be kind to yourself, that there are going to be times when you're like, nope, not going there. Not going to do it. And then wait a minute, because you got a lot of help. You got a lot of help to help you get there. And like you say, I've done so many forgiveness meditations. Once you can drop that hot burning coal of anger and despair, you feel better. When we first went through this, I remember our priest telling me, well, you're going to have to forgive her. You're not going to get into heaven. And I thought, I think I'm done with this church. I think the fact is this. Once you can forgive, they also say that holding on to anger is like you swallowing poison and then hoping the other person's going to die. Once you can forgive, like you say, the burden comes off of you. It has nothing to do with, the country club called heaven. It's not a dues paid. It's an emotional release for you yourself. That once you can get back to that space where you can let that go.
Yeah.
I really like what you said, Julie, and so many things, but one of the ideas that you shared was, to be kind to yourself, give yourself grace, because this forgiveness thing, we get to practice, and we're not perfect, and it's not always easy. And I think, it could be easy for someone to say, well, I didn't do it again, or I failed in this area, and just to go, I'm just not that kind of person that can forgive. But what you had said is give yourself kindness and grace, and maybe pay attention to the progress that we're making, and keep practicing it.
Go ahead.
Well, I think the other piece of this too is that during the grieving process, we're never at the same place at the same time.
Right.
Because our experiences were so different. Julie was there at the scene, had to process the horror that she experienced and saw. I was not there, but I had to start to get my mind around this trauma on a, multi-hour plane ride home and try to put this all into context. And while I took a couple weeks off work shortly after Lauren was killed, I went back to a very demanding job in an executive role at a large company. And so I was able to almost push it aside for a moment to get back into the river of work. Julie didn't. Julie was home and had to deal with the immediacy of it and trying to establish a normal routine again, which is extremely difficult. And so we were never at the same place at the same time during our grief journey. And Julie had done a lot more of the work than I had. And so by the time Julie started to come out of the pit, I was heading down into it. And I'm going to say the whole process took us about 4 years for both of us to work through it. And so along the way, you have to be patient with each other.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, Doug. I think that's very insightful. And I know Kelly and I experienced what we went through very differently as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's natural to a degree.
And Julie, one of the things that you had brought up also was when you work on that forgiveness, we talk about claiming your freedom. We talk about getting that burden off of you, and that's what you had mentioned. That gives you the freedom to actually feel more, to experience more, and to try to understand it even more.
So true. The other thing I was thinking, I just had a great poetry prompt the other day that said, in the end, failure is inevitable, which sounds awful, right? Except the poem that came out of it was so positive. Because here's the jam. If you're putting the effort into finding forgiveness, you are succeeding. Because it's the effort that matters. You may never get to forgiveness until you cross the bridge. But if you're trying, that's success.
Amen.
So I say to anybody who's working on it, you're doing it. You're doing it.
Oh,
Wow. I think that's
I love it. That's so good. Because I think we can get in our head. Like, I don't know if I'm there. I don't know if I've done it, but you're already there.
It's the intention, right?
Right.
The intention
The
to put that
intention's what
effort out.
matters. Right.
It's a great way to wrap it, Sean.
I love it. Yeah.
I want to wrap first with saying I'm really inspired by the work that you're doing around grief and loss. Because when you talk about closing the door and going in the dark, and that's what I did originally with my grief, because I really didn't have anybody to share it with, and I didn't want to make others uncomfortable. And it wasn't until I opened the door to it that I really started healing. And knowing you're providing that source, that resource, and that help for others is such a beautiful thing. So I just want to tell you to keep going.
Thank you very
Yes,
much.
keep going.
Kelly,
Yeah.
if I could put one more pitch in for Julie's
Please.
organization that she started,
Please.
Grieve Well, and particularly when it comes to peer counseling or peer support, mentorship. The fact that when you're in that pit, I could never imagine experiencing joy again.
Right.
It's a concept that is so foreign at that point that how am I ever going to get there? And to be able to sit down with someone who's already walked this journey, walk through the valley and come up the other side, it provides a little bit of hope in a situation where you can't even imagine that you can ever achieve that goal. And that was, to me, it was so much more powerful than, talking to a therapist of any kind, because you needed the inspiration of someone that's already walked the walk.
The word hope, and you do need the inspiration, but I felt I also needed the permission
For sure.
to
right.
tell myself you can feel
Right.
joy again.
And the other piece of that is that once you become, if you can take your grief and become a peer, there's your purpose right there. So not everybody can build a playground or start a foundation or whatever, but you always have that experience that you now can use to help the next person up the ladder.
Yeah.
And that's invaluable. Our counselors, I can't tell you how they have grown. And we have volunteers who've been with us for 10 years. Volunteers don't stay around with organizations for 10 years. It's just a powerful, powerful experience to do that.
I'm so glad that you put your pain into purpose with what you've done for grief, because a lot of people don't understand how to even start the process of grieving. And that's why we're so happy when we talk about our workbook that you had mentioned earlier and getting that pain into purpose. And we provide this workbook with everybody who even wants to try to take a moment and forgive in a situation as tough as this or any situation, to get yourself started And we can't thank you guys enough, Doug and Julie, for being part of our program today and for helping to change other people's perspective on how they can start to maybe get into that process of grieving and getting to the other side of even forgiving, but most importantly, finding the freedom.
Thank
Julie
you.
and Doug, we're wrapping our arms around you both, and thank you so much for sharing today and for helping to change the way we deal with grief and the way we talk about it.
Yeah, thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
All right,
too.
guys.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye.
Thanks so much. I was thinking the same thing Doug mentioned when he said, there was a moment where I felt like I would never be able to find joy again in my life. I think if you put yourself in that spot that he was in and they were in, you'd feel the same way. I mean,
It's a darkness that you could feel through him. I mean, I'm listening to him say those words, and I was like, I can't. You know, how many times, Kelly, have you heard this phrase? And we've talked about this on this show. I can't imagine.
A lot.
A lot.
But
and that's not the right thing to say.
But you can put yourself in that spot right there,
Yeah.
and you can relate that.
Well, I have to say, at the beginning of the episode, I mean, that was just so raw of emotion.
Yes.
And I had no idea we would end up where we did by the end of the call talking about forgiveness. I didn't even know if that was an option on the table.
Right.
And it was a beautiful thing where we ended and how she really talked about it. It has been a struggle. It's not been easy, but she keeps practicing and giving herself.
Well, she even said it comes and goes. I think she meant with in respect to the young lady driving the bus.
Yeah. I
But
think
she
you're right.
also said, you react because that's what we first have to do. But then you do get a chance to respond.
Sure.
And look at the way they're responding.
And I'm sure that people that were just tuning in and just hearing this story, as we mentioned, didn't know that this had happened so long ago because, as you said, raw. It was so raw when she started to talk about it in the beginning. I was just riveted. And she described it, and I just shake my head and want to hold her and her daughter in my arms, and you know.
your heart goes
And you're
out
right.
for 'em.
Look where we ended up, because I didn't think we would get there, and I'm certainly glad we did. We learned a lot.
We did, and I thought it was really cool for him to share that, you know, grief is it's the own unique thing, and no one ever does it at the exact time, exact space together. But when she said going in the pit, he was out of it, but when she came out, he was going in, but they were there for one another. And look where they are now.
I'm so glad you're doing your documentary on grief with Just Like You Films, and glad we were able to help that progression in getting the financial support for this, because that's a very important discussion that a lot of people don't know how to even start to get into.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that, Sean. I think it's important. I think it's necessary. And I do believe that we can change the conversation around loss and grief and forgiveness by, this amazing work.
Yeah. Thank you, Doug and Julie. Thank you so much for listening and for watching Time for Forgiveness. Hey, listen, visit our website at timeforforgiveness.org. And here's the great news. You can now download our workbook. Just click on the QR code. It's that simple. You can also message us on our website because we read every single message, and we certainly love to help. You can also reach us on our socials on Instagram and Facebook, and you can email us, again, at info@timeforforgiveness.org. I'm Sean Parr for Bob and Kelly Pascuzzi. We'll see you next time on Time for Forgiveness.